The back room of Ash Fork Mercantile smelled of kerosene sawdust and the sour breath of men who had been drinking since 10 in the morning. October of 1885 had come in dry and mean across the Powder River country, and 13 people had crowded into that room to see what a dead woman in a draw had left behind. Two clerks leaned against the counter pretending to count nails but watching sideways with their mouths half open. Three ranch hands sat on flour barrels passing a tin flask, the youngest already flushed pink. The freight agent stood by the door with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. The Methodist preacher's wife had come out of what she called Christian curiosity. Two boarding house women whispered behind gloved hands. The town constable had his boots up on a shipping crate, and a boy of about 12, someone's son, watched from behind a barrel of pickled beets with the wide, unblinking stare of a child memorizing something for later. Thora Ashwell stood in the center of that room with $1.12 in her coat pocket, a canvas satchel at her feet, holding her mother's Bible, and a silver darning needle. In the perfect stillness that comes to 17-year-old girls who have already learned that flinching does not help. She was tall for her age, but thin from a hard year, her wheat-colored hair pulled into a single braid that fell past her shoulder blades. Her cheekbones showed sharp underskin that had not seen enough meat in 6 months. Her eyes were the color of river ice under a gray sky, and they did not move from the woman reading the papers. Prudence Ashfork wore a black bombazine as though attending a funeral, which she was in a manner of speaking. Not the aunts, the girls. Her jaw stayed clenched even when she was not speaking, giving her the look of a woman who had bitten down on something bitter 20 years ago and had never let go of it. She held the probate document in both hands and read in the careful, punishing voice of someone who wanted every word to land. 14 acres of wind, a dying stand of birch above the little powder breaks, a shack fit for storing potatoes. She folded the paper along its crease, looked up, and let the room have its moment. The ranch hands went first. One of them slapped his knee hard enough to spill the flask. The freight agent laughed with his mouth closed, which was somehow worse. The preacher's wife covered her lips with 2 fingers and giggled the way women giggle when they have decided in advance that a thing will be funny. The constable took his boots off the crate to sit up straighter so he could see the girl's face. Prudence Ashfork waited until the laughter had run its course. Then she looked at Thora with something that was not quite pity and not quite pleasure. Even the dead, she said, have found a way to hand a girl a joke. The boy behind the beet barrel did not laugh. Neither did an old man Thora had not noticed until that moment, standing back against the wall by the door to the freight yard. He was maybe 68, with a beard gone white at the chin and darker at the corners of his mouth, one shoulder set lower than the other from decades of a teamster's whip, and one eyelid that sagged over a pale blue eye. He watched Thora the way a man watches a horse he is considering buying, with attention rather than sympathy. When she looked back at him, he did not look away. She said thank you to the room, though nothing had been given to her that deserved thanks. She picked up the satchel. She walked out through the front of the store, past the counter with its jars of penny licorice and its coil of new rope, past the pot-bellied stove, where 2 dogs slept, past the window that showed the muddy street and a wagon and a horse with its head down against the wind. She reached the boardwalk before she realized her hands were shaking. The old man came out behind her without hurry. He stopped at the corner of the porch and made no move to touch her. Ingrid told me to give this to whoever came for the claim. His voice was low and rough, like something dragged across gravel. He held out a small brass key on a leather thong. Don't ask what it opens. You'll know when you know. She took the key. It weighed almost nothing. The metal was warm from his pocket. She wanted to ask his name, wanted to ask 100 things, but the laughter from the back room had not quite finished with her yet, and she was afraid her voice would break. He seemed to understand. He touched the brim of his hat, turned, and walked back inside. She put the key in the coat pocket that did not have money in it because she did not yet know which one mattered more. 2 days later, she rode south in the back of a borrowed mule cart driven by a freighter named Cobb, who owed a favor to the livery stable and wanted nothing to do with conversation. The road out of Ash Fork Landing started decent packed dirt and clean ruts, the kind of track a man could follow half asleep. After 5 miles, the ruts got shallow, After 7, they disappeared. The last 4 miles were a suggestion more than a road, marked only by the memory of wheels that had gone before, and by the way the sagebrush grew thinner where hooves had beaten it down. The little powder breaks opened around her like a wound. The river had cut the plateau into a labyrinth of buttes and coulees, exposing bands of clay and scoria-striped rust, and gray and dull yellow, as though God had started a project and walked off in the middle. From a distance, the country looked strange and unfinished. Up close, it looked worse. Nothing green stayed green here for long. Even the sage had a dusty, exhausted look, as though it had given up trying to be a color. The draw came into view in the last hour before dark. A shallow fold in the bluffs, sheltered on 3 sides by eroded clay ridges, with a stand of birch and box elder running along a dry seep bed. The trees were not impressive. They were crooked and wind-bent. Their bark split their branches, carrying the appearance of having lost too many fights and stopped bothering to defend themselves. The cabin sat at the base of the draw where the birch grew thickest. One room may be 12 feet by 14 with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls made of logs that had never been properly chinked. The stovepipe leaned east so hard it looked like it had been pushed by a hand. The door had swelled in its frame. Cobb had to put his shoulder into it twice before it moved. Inside, the smell came at her in layers. Mouse nests, old ash, something damp that had been damp a long time. The floor was packed earth with a few planks laid over the worst of it. The stove was a small sheet iron box, rusted at the seams but whole. One window on the south wall, greased paper over cracked glass, let in a smear of dying gray light. A rope and pole bed frame stood along the west wall. A table wobbled when she touched it. A shelf held 3 tin cups and a cookpot with a hole punched clean through the bottom. Cobb set her satchel just inside the door and did not come further. "You sure about this?" It was not really a question. She was not sure of anything. But 9 miles behind her waited a town that had laughed at her, and 11 miles behind that waited a boarding house where the owner's son had put his hand where it did not belong, and where the owner had decided the problem was Thora. The document folded inside her satchel said, this rotting room in this dead-end draw belonged to her, and belonging to something, even something like this, was a condition she had not experienced in 3 years. She said she was sure. He grunted, tipped his hat halfway, and left before full dark. She listened to the cart creak back up the track until she could not hear it anymore. Then there was only the wind in the birches, making that sound like a knife being sharpened, and the settling of a building that had been empty for 3 summers. She stood in the doorway and thought about how the cold of a place gets into the bones of a house first, and then it waits for someone soft to come inside. She did not sleep that first night. She sat on the edge of the bed frame with her coat still on and her boots still laced, watching the dark corners of the room and running her tongue over her teeth so she could keep track of the small warm places on her body. She thought about the long walk back to town. 9 miles was nothing if a person started at dawn. She could find kitchen work again somewhere. She could make herself small and useful and easy to ignore the way she had always survived. And no one would think less of her for having tried and failed at this. But something kept her in that chair. It was not courage. She would have called it something else if she had known the word for it. It was more like the feeling of a stone in a shoe that a person keeps walking on because taking the boot off would mean stopping, and stopping felt more dangerous than the pain. Toward morning, she slept sitting up, and when she woke, the light in the greased window was the color of skimmed milk. She spent the first full day walking the 14 acres. The draw held perhaps 40 birch trees, a scattering of box elder, and a dry seep bed that ran clear when she scraped at it with the edge of her boot heel, which meant water was down there somewhere if she had the strength to find it. The cabin was worse in daylight than it had been at dusk. The northwest corner had sunk far enough that the wall logs had separated from the roof beam, and she could see gray sky through the gap. The chinking between the logs had fallen out in long sections, leaving finger-wide cracks where the wind came through like it owned the address. She built a small fire with dead branches she collected outside, and the heat rose straight up and out through the leaking roof, warming her hands for the 12 seconds it took to lift them and dropping to nothing the moment she stepped away. She was on her knees near the stove that afternoon, scraping at a rust patch to see whether the sheet iron was still sound when her palm pressed a plank and the sound came back wrong. Not rotted, hollow. She sat back on her heels. She rapped a knuckle against 3 more planks. All 3 answered normal, thick, and dull. She rapped the first one again. Hollow. She looked closer. The nails had been driven and pulled and driven again more than once over years. One corner of the board lifted a hair above the others, as though the last hand to press it down had been in a hurry. She got the flat of the darning needle under the edge, then a bent stove poker, then her fingers. The plank came up with a soft protest of old wood. The 2 beside it came up easier. Below was packed earth, and set into that earth was a nailed pine box wrapped in oilcloth. The oilcloth had kept out most of the damp. Her hands did not shake when she lifted the box out. That surprised her. She carried it to the table. She untied the twine. She peeled back the oilcloth. Under the cloth lay a folded pouch of tanned deer hide tied shut with a leather cord heavier than it looked. She set it aside. Below the pouch lay 9 ledger-sized notebooks, stacked in order, each with a hand-lettered label on the cover. The first said, "First cold." The second said, "Second cold." She counted forward. 3rd cold. After the blue norther. 5th. 6th. On to the 9th on top of the pile, and beneath it more tied in a second bundle. 19 notebooks in total. 19 winters counted by a woman who had measured her years in survival rather than in almanacs. Under the notebooks, she found 2 folded maps, hand-copied, showing wind patterns across the territory in an arrow and notation script Thora did not yet recognize as her aunt's. A carpenter's rule with pencil marks along the wooden edge. A packet of letters tied with twine. She untied the deer hide pouch last. Inside were coins. Gold eagles and half eagles, $47, in a country where a laborer earned $1 a day. She held one of the coins between her thumb and forefinger for a long time before setting it back. She had never held that much money in her life. She turned to the letters. The top one was addressed in a careful, spidery hand to the Ashwell child, if bookish and stubborn. Care of the Episcopal Girls' Home in Jamestown, forwarded through the offices of Prudence Ashfork Merchant, Ashfork Landing, Wyoming Territory. The postmark was 18 months old. The seal was unbroken. Prudence had received it, kept it, and never sent it on. Thora set the letter on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood on either side of it, and made her breathing go slow. The wind outside changed direction, and a thin thread of cold came in under the door and touched her ankle. She opened the letter. Her aunt's handwriting was small, precise, and slanted to the right, as though every word had been leaning forward to reach the next one. The letter said that Ingrid Ashwell, of the Little Powder Claim, wished the girl to know that the 14 acres and the cabin and the notebooks contained therein were meant for her if she came, and only for her. That the girl should not be discouraged by what the town would say. That what she would find in the cabin was worth more than what anyone in Ashfork Landing would tell her it was worth. That the writer regretted not being able to fetch her in person, being unwell, and that she hoped the letter would find its way. At the bottom, in the same steady hand, what saves you in a hard country is often the thing people laugh at before they understand it. Thora read the line 3 times. Then she opened the first notebook. A thin wall is a promise to the wind. She sat down on the packed earth floor with her back against the crooked log wall and did not stand up for 4 hours. The light in the window faded to nothing. She lit the stub of a candle she found on the shelf and read by that until the wax ran out onto her fingers. She read that her aunt had bought this relinquished claim in 1863 for $18 and moved into the cabin that fall with 2 axes, a coffee mill, a rope, and what the notebook called a question. The question was whether a woman could keep herself alive in a country like this one by observation and the correct arrangement of ordinary materials, and by nothing else at all. Not by luck, not by charity, not by any man's hand. She read that in the first winter her aunt had nearly died. That the north wall lost heat the way a man loses blood from a gut wound, slow and steady and fatal, if you did not find the wound. That she had found it. The wound was the walls themselves. She read the diagram in the seventh notebook that showed stacked firewood along the inside of every wall. Split side turned inward, with a hand's width of air between the wood and the log. She read the phrase, "Dead air is better than moving air." She read that in the coldest week of the ninth winter, her aunt had measured a 30-degree difference between the outer log and the inner face of the wood stack, and that the stove had held its heat through a night that killed cattle standing in the field. She read that the woman had not finished the work. The last notebook stopped in the middle of a sentence. "The final piece I have not tested is the candle guttered." Thora closed the notebook and pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw dark red waves. Then she stood up still in her coat and she looked at the walls of the cabin. Not at the room, at the walls themselves. At the crooked logs and the gaps in the chinking and the wind coming through as though the building had been drawn on paper rather than built. Then she looked at the door and beyond it at the memory of the birch stand outside. 40 crooked trees that everyone in Ashford Landing had called worthless. Something opened in her that had no name. Not a match. A door. She sat down at the table and began to make lists. Wood to be cut. Deadfall to be cleared before the ground froze. Chinking to be mixed from clay and straw before the seatbed locked in ice. Runners to be built to keep the stack off the packed earth. A widened stove safety zone so a spark could not reach the inner face of the wall. Every task in her aunt's notebook that had a check mark and every task that did not. She wrote until her hand cramped. When she looked up, the window was gray again. She had missed the whole night without noticing it pass. 3 days later, she walked 11 miles back to Ash Fork Landing. She left the coins under the plank because a girl carrying gold in her coat was a girl inviting a particular kind of trouble. She took only the intercepted letter and one dry biscuit in a canteen of seatbed water. She reached the mercantile at mid-afternoon. The bell above the door made its small tin sound. Prudence Ashfork looked up from the counter where she was measuring calico by the yard, and something in her face went carefully still. Thora crossed the floor without hurrying. She laid the letter on the polished wood between the bolts of cloth and the brass scale. She turned it so the address faced Prudence right side up. "You knew I had family." Her voice was quieter than she had expected and steadier. "You knew I had money coming. You let me scrub your kitchen for 6 months and said nothing." Prudence did not look at the letter. She looked at Thora's face, and for a long moment her jaw worked without producing sound. Then she reached out one gloved hand and drew the letter toward her across the counter, slow as though pulling a splinter from a place she could not see. Thora did not wait for an answer. There was not one that would have been worth the walk. She turned and left the store, and the bell above the door made its small tin sound behind her. That night back in the cabin, she sat by the stove and burned a piece of green box elder that spat and hissed and gave off almost no heat because she had not yet learned which wood was worth burning and which was worth waiting on. She held the brass key on its leather thong and turned it over in the firelight. It did not match any lock in the room. She had checked every seam of every board, knelt at the stove door, run her fingers along the underside of the shelf. The key did not belong to anything she could see. She set it back on the table. She opened the third notebook to a page marked with a strip of red ribbon. The wind teaches her aunt had written there in a hand grown a little tired, a little slanted from cold. If you listen, it does not lie. Outside, the birches made their sharpening sound. A coyote called somewhere down the draw, and another answered from the ridge above the seep. The stove popped once as a knot let go. Thora closed the notebook and set her hand flat on the cover the way a person sets a hand on a Bible. She was going to finish it. The first winter came for her in earnest by December. She had managed to stack wood against only the north wall and half the west before the ground froze, and the birch stand became too treacherous to work in the dark. What she had built helped, but not enough. She woke in the mornings with frost feathering the inside of the wash basin, her breath hanging in clouds that drifted toward the stove and dissolved. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her hip bones pressed into the rope and pole mattress hard enough to leave bruises she discovered when she changed her clothes for the first time in 2 weeks. She ate what the draw gave her, dried choke cherries still hanging on the branch with their skins wrinkled. One rabbit she trapped badly and cried while skinning, not from sentiment, but because her hands shook so badly she could not make clean cuts, and wasted meat she could not replace. Wild onions dug from frozen ground, a handful of rose hips that tasted like sour leather and left her mouth raw. She boiled the rabbit bones twice. In February, the wolves came down from the breaks, just as her aunts note had promised. She heard them first, a sound that the wind made room for the way it makes room for nothing else, low and purposeful and close. She climbed to the rafter and lifted down the sharps. She had never fired it. She did not know whether it was loaded. In the dark, she ran her fingers over the mechanism, the way a person reads a page by feel, and found that it was, and stood by the door with it across her forearms, and waited until the sound moved away. In the morning, she found their tracks in the crust of old snow that had frozen overnight into something almost like stone. The prints went all the way around the cabin in a patient circuit and then into the birch stand, and she followed them until she was standing in the center of the grove, looking at the place 20 feet from her door, where the pack had stopped and sat for what the compressed snow told her had been a long time. They had watched the cabin through the trees all night. They had decided for reasons she did not understand and was grateful for not to push their luck. She went back inside and took the sharps down from the rafter every night after that until spring. Spring came slow to the breaks. The snow went off in patches, leaving mud that sucked at her boots and made every step cost twice what it should. But the birch stand was accessible again, and she had the notebooks, and she had one winter's worth of hard lessons in what her body could actually do when there was no choice about it. She started with the north wall, tearing down her hasty winter stacking and rebuilding it from the bottom with the care her aunt had described in the 6th notebook. Floor runners made from salvaged lumber she hauled from a collapsed outbuilding half a mile up the draw, raised enough off the packed earth to allow air to circulate underneath. She set them 18 inches out from the log wall all the way around, creating a channel she could stack into. The stacking itself was methodical, split face inward because the flat surface created tighter contact and trapped more dead air between the pieces. Lengths of 16 to 20 inches because that was the height she could manage without the stacks losing their plumb. Every fourth course cross-laid for stability, a modification her aunt had never mentioned, but that Thora worked out after her second collapse. When she stood in the debris of an hour's work and understood that the stack had failed at the corner where the courses met without interlock, her body changed with the work. The thinness of the first winter burned off and was replaced by something harder. Her shoulders widened across the back in a way she noticed when she reached for something on a high shelf. Her palms turned shiny and then hard calloused, past the point where they felt like her own skin, more like the handles of the tools she used than the hands that held them. She stopped thinking of the work as labor and started thinking of it as argument, a long-running disagreement with the cold about who owned the space inside those walls. It was in late May, on a morning when the seatbed was running clean for the first time all year, and the box elder was putting out new leaves in that yellow-green color that only lasts about a week, that she heard a horse on the track above the draw. She came out with the sharps at her side, not raised, just present. A man came down leading a raw-boned roan by the halter, moving with the careful economy of someone whose joints had opinions about certain types of ground. It was the old man from the mercantile, the one with the sagging eyelid and the low shoulder, who had given her the key. He stopped at the edge of the birch stand and looked at her for a moment. "Silas Trueblood," he said, "in case you wondered." She had wondered. He looked past her at the cabin, at the stovepipe which she had straightened and resealed with clay, at the new chinking she had packed into the worst of the gaps. He had the evaluating eye of a man who had spent his life building things in places where building was difficult, and she could see him reading what she had done, the way she read her aunt's notebooks, with attention to what the evidence told him rather than what he had expected to find. He had not come to help. He told her that plainly in the way of men who have decided that honesty saves more time than manners. He had come because Ingrid Ashwell had borrowed something from him in the year 1870, a carpentry-sounding book his son Everett had made during his apprenticeship, and Everett had been dead since Gettysburg of July 1863, and the book was the last thing his son had put his hands on for any length of time, and he wanted it back. She found it in the bottom of the oilcloth box wedged beneath the folded maps. A slim volume hand-stitched the covers made of thin cedar plank with Everett Trueblood's name in a young man's careful block letters on the first page. Silas took it from her and opened it at the table, and she watched his face while he read, and what she saw there was not grief exactly. It was older than grief. It was what grief turns into when a person has carried it for 22 years and it has worn smooth. Then he went still. He turned a page. He turned another. He read for a quarter of an hour without speaking, and when he finally looked up, his pale eye was red at the rim. She wrote in the margins, he said. Thora knew. She had read those marginal notes herself in the winter months when she was trying to understand the load-bearing logic behind her aunt's floor runner design. Ingrid had taken her nephew's apprentice notes on wood joinery and load paths and stress points and added to them over years from her own 19 winters of watching what held and what failed in a structure that was doing battle with the cold. Everett would have been proud of this, Silas said mostly to himself. Then he closed the book and set it on the table. Your aunt made a better thing of his work than he could have at his age. That's a debt. I'll pay it in teaching if you'll have it. She said she would have it. He came 3 days a week through that summer and the fall that followed, riding out from Ash Fork Landing on the Rhone with his tools in the saddlebag and his opinions about the work ready and specific. He showed her how to distribute weight across the floor runners so the planks would not sink unevenly under the load of a full wall. He showed her how to drive ceiling cleats for the upper courses so the stacks stayed plumb when humidity shifted the wood. He demonstrated a dovetail key at the corners where two walls met, a technique from his Army carpentry days that locked the intersecting stacks against the lateral pressure that had toppled her earlier attempts. He showed her how to read moisture in a piece of wood by the sound it made when you rapped it with your knuckle, a dry piece ringing clean and a wet piece answering with a thud that meant trouble waiting. What he could not teach her, he told her to figure alone, because that was, he said, the part that would actually belong to her when it was done. By August, she had completed the north and west walls floor to ceiling, the dead air gap intact behind each course. She began taking temperature measurements every morning the way her aunt had at floor level near the stove and at the outer edge of the stack. On a morning when the outside read 41 degrees, the floor by the stove read 63, and the outer face of the north wall read 48. 17 degrees of difference across 3 feet of stacked birch. The wood was doing what the notebook said it would do. She stood with her palm pressed flat against the inner face and felt the faint cool of it and thought about her aunt sitting in the same room through 19 winters, writing down numbers that nobody had believed. In August, a man came to the draw who had not been invited. Barclay Moss ran the largest woodyard in Ash Fork Landing. He was broad through the shoulders with a beard that hid most of his expression, though his eyes did not hide anything, and he had the ease of movement of a man who had spent his life knowing he was the biggest person in most rooms. He rode a good horse, which told Thora something. Men who ride good horses in country like this are either wealthy or making a point about being wealthy, and the distinction matters. He did not threaten. He made an offer. $800 for the 14 acres in the cabin and whatever was in it. He framed it as generosity. He framed it as concern for a young woman living alone in difficult country. He said the land was not really suited to what she seemed to be trying to do with it, and that she was young enough to start fresh somewhere. A person could make something of themselves. She knew what he was buying. Not the land, the silence. If the method her aunt had worked out over 19 winters became known, if people built their own insulated walls from wood, they cut themselves and burned their supply more slowly and efficiently, they would need less from the moss yard. They would need his emergency shelter space less in hard winters. The $800 was the price he put on not having that happen. She told him no thank you and meant it the way a door means it when it is closed. 3 weeks later, someone set fire to the drying shed she had spent the summer building with slatted walls for air circulation. She smelled it before she saw it, a particular smell of seasoned wood burning fast, and she came out of the cabin at a run with a bucket and the draw well, and spent 2 hours fighting a fire that she lost in the first 10 minutes. Half a quart of box elder she had spent 6 months curing to the right moisture level went to ash and coals in the space of one night. Silas came the next morning and crouched over the debris and turned pieces of charred wood over with a stick until he found what he was looking for. He held up a fragment that had not fully burned, the underside still pale. He pressed his thumb into the pale wood and showed her the smear. Coal oil. Someone had helped this fire start. She knew who. Silas knew who. The constable in Ash Fork Landing was Barkley Moss's first cousin, and both of them knew that too. Silas straightened up with the slow hydraulics of a man whose joints charged interest on every movement. He had the look on his face that she had come to recognize as his preparation for saying something he considered important. "I'll go to Moss," he told her. "I'll make him understand this stops here." She shook her head. She said it plainly and without apology. "If you go, your lungs will not handle what comes after. You know that. If I rebuild the shed and cut new wood and say nothing, I survive the winter. One of those outcomes is useful and one is not, and I choose the useful one." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she did not quite have a word for: recognition, perhaps, or the satisfaction a teacher feels when a student has understood something that cannot be taught directly. He did not go to Moss. She rebuilt the shed in 6 weeks, working before dawn and after dark, and she did not speak of it in town when she went in for salt and lamp oil, and she worked with the particular focused fury of a person who has decided that anger is most useful when it is converted directly into labor. It was while she was felling a birch at the north end of the stand one afternoon in September that she saw it. The tree was old, one of the largest in the grove, its bark pale and marked with the black diamond patterns that the oldest birches carry. At eye level, cut into the bark with something sharp in the careful strokes of a person who wanted the marks to last, were 2 letters in a year. 1864. Below the letters, in the same careful hand, 4 words: "For the child who comes after." Ingrid had carved this in the 2nd year she was here, 1 year after arriving, before she had proven anything, before the notebooks had filled with evidence. She had cut those words into the oldest tree in the grove in the winter of 1864, when she was 41 years old, before Thora's mother was married, before Thora existed in any form at all. She had simply known with the certainty of a person who has decided to build something intended to outlast her that someone would come after. Thora stood with her palm flat against the carved letters until her hand was cold from the bark. She had a visitor of a different kind in early October when Dr. Amos Doyle came out from Ash Fork Landing to check on Silas, whose cough had developed a new quality, wetter and deeper, that both of them had been pretending not to notice. Doyle was the town's only physician, overworked and perpetually behind on sleep, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, and the manner of a man who had learned to absorb difficult information without visible reaction, because reacting visibly took time he did not have. He examined Silas by the stove and said nothing reassuring when he was done. Then he stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, the way a man turns when he is trying to understand the entirety of something at once. He asked her questions. How thick were the stacks? What species of wood? How wide was the gap? What was the temperature differential she had been measuring? She answered each one precisely with numbers, the way her aunt had taught her to think about the problem. He was quiet for a long time after. Then he said that what she had built was not a folk remedy or a frontier improvisation. What she had built was applied physics. The wood had low thermal conductivity and therefore did not transmit cold the way stone or iron did. The gap trapped air that did not move, and still air did not carry heat away from the room. The secondary shell interrupted infiltration from the outer wall. Every piece of it was sound. He wrote a 1-page circular that same week, had it printed at the land office in Ash Fork Landing, and tacked copies to the board outside the mercantile and at the freight depot. He put Ingrid's name on it above Thora's because Thora insisted. The copies were gone within 4 days, taken down by whose hands she could only guess, but she guessed without difficulty. In the last week of October, with the east wall half done and the south wall barely started, Silas sat at her table after a long day's work and held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her across the steam with the expression of a man sorting through what he is willing to say and what he is going to keep. He told her about Ingrid Ashwell, not the version the town knew, which was that she was an eccentric who had lined her walls with wood like a squirrel gone strange and had died alone because she was the kind of woman who ended up alone. The true version. Ingrid had been a field nurse at Antietam in September of 1862. She had spent 36 hours in the Poffenberger farm, tending men whose injuries Silas described with the brevity of someone who had been adjacent to that battle and did not require elaboration. Her husband, Reuben, an infantry corporal, had died there. Her son, Micah, 4 years old and in the care of a neighbor, died of typhoid fever the following spring. She had come to Wyoming Territory in the fall of 1863 with a single question she had decided she needed to answer by herself in a place that would not let her cheat on the answer. Whether a person stripped of every ordinary support, every convenience, every other human being could survive by the quality of her own thinking. She was not hiding, Silas said. She was testing. There's a difference that matters. Thora understood the difference. She had been doing the same thing, had been doing it since the first night she sat on the bed frame in this room and decided not to walk back to town. And there is something else, Silas said. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at the brass key on its leather thong, which sat on the table where it had sat for over a year without opening anything. Ingrid told me there was a piece of the work she had not finished. She would not tell me what it was. She said the person who came after would know where to look when they were ready. I don't know what that means. I have been waiting for you to figure it out. He went home that night on the roan, coughing into his elbow on the track above the draw, and Thora stood in the doorway listening until the hoofbeats faded into the wind and silence closed back over the brakes, the way water closes over a stone. November came in cold and direct. She finished the east wall by the third week. The south wall she completed in the first days of December, working in temperatures that meant she could only stay outside for an hour before the cold made her hands too stiff to hold the axe. The living space inside the cabin was now 8 feet by 8 feet, barely enough to turn around in. The room breathed differently. When she moved from the door to the stove, the air was the same temperature the whole way. No drafts, no cold corridors near the floor, no frost on the inner log wall behind the stacks. The stove ran steady at half the wood it had burned in her first winter to hold the same heat. Silas came less frequently as December deepened. The cough was taking more of him. Some mornings he could not make the ride. He sent word through the livery boy on those days, brief notes in a hand that was still precise if somewhat slower than it had been in the spring. She noted the change but did not speak of it because he did not want it spoken of, and she had learned enough about this particular man to know that what he wanted from her was not concern but continuation. She kept the notebooks. She kept the temperature records. She watched the sky in the mornings the way her aunt's early notebook said to watch it, paying attention to which direction the clouds moved at altitude versus at the ground, learning the small differences in the quality of cold that predicted whether a hard snap would hold or break. She also watched the brass key. She turned it over in her fingers most evenings, looking at it in the lamplight, thinking about what her aunt might have locked and where. She had checked every surface in the cabin, every plank, every joint in the floor. The key had not opened anything, but Silas's words stayed with her. She said the person who came after would know where to look when they were ready. Not when they looked hard enough, when they were ready. January of 1888 arrived wearing the face of spring. The 9th dawned warm, 40 degrees by mid-morning, with a soft southwest wind that smelled almost of thaw. Snow melted off the south slope of the ridge above the draw. Men in Ash Fork Landing came out of their front doors without their coats and stood in the pale sun looking satisfied. Children ran in the schoolyard at noon without their scarves. Silas appeared at her door in the last hour of afternoon light, having made the 11 miles despite his cough, which had gotten bad enough in the previous week that she had not expected to see him until it eased. He was wearing both his coats, which she noted because the day was too warm for both coats. He had his old army barometer under his arm, a brass instrument in a leather case that he had carried since the Wilderness Campaign of 1864. He showed her the needle without speaking. It had dropped 3 points since morning. She looked at the sky to the northwest, a shade of gray-white that she had come to think of as the color a sky goes when it is considering something serious. The wind at the surface was southwest and soft. The clouds at altitude were moving from the northwest at a pace that meant they were ahead of something. Bad, she said. Worse than that, he told her. He had seen that needle read that low exactly once before in 40 years of watching it in the winter of 1872, and what had followed then had killed 17 head of cattle on the ranch where he was working, and 2 men who were out checking on them. She spent the remaining daylight bringing in wood. She filled every vessel in the cabin with water. She checked the stovepipe where it passed through the roof and repacked the clay seal around the flashing. She had Silas eat something because he had ridden 11 miles, and she suspected he had not eaten before coming. He ate without argument, which told her more about his condition than the cough had. The temperature started dropping before sunset. By dark, it was 10 below. By the time they both slept, it was 20 below, and the wind had shifted to the northwest and was looking for weaknesses in the world. By morning, the outside thermometer read 32 below and dropping. Inside at floor level by the stove, the second thermometer read 48 above. The walls held. The stove ran steady, fed from the innermost courses one split at a time, never exposing more than a few inches of the log shell behind it. The second day of the storm, the wind came up past anything she could measure by sound alone. A continuous roar that made the rafters flex and the cabin walls creak in registers she had not heard before. Silas stayed in the rocker by the stove with a wool blanket across his knees and slept most of the day, which she was glad for, because when he was awake, he heard the sounds the walls were making, and his expression told her he was calculating odds she did not want calculated. The third night was the one that changed everything. She was banking the fire around midnight when the wait came at the door. Not a knock, a wait. She took the sharps from its place against the wall and stood to the side of the door, not in front of it, because she had learned from the wolves to be particular about where she stood when something unknown was on the other side. She unbarred the door with her free hand and pulled it open against the wind, which tried to take it from her. Silas fell across the threshold like something that had already spent everything it had on the journey and had nothing left for the landing. Ice crusted the full length of his beard. His eyes were open, which was the important thing. On his back, lashed to his shoulders with a length of freight rope, tied in the flat, serviceable knots of a man who had spent 68 years around working rope, were 2 children bundled inside a single blanket. The Delaney girls. Nell, the older one, was 7, and conscious, her eyes fixed on Thora's face with the specific focus of a child who has decided that this person is the one thing standing between her and something she cannot name. Ruth, 5 years old, was not conscious. Her lips had gone the wrong color. Their father worked the coal chute at the freight yard. Their mother had died in August of a burst appendix, and they had been living above the yard office in a room with a north wall that had never been properly sealed. Silas had walked 11 miles through this storm with both of them on his back. She did not let herself think about what that had cost him until much later, when there was time for thinking. She dragged all 3 of them across the threshold and kicked the door shut against the wind and drove the bar home. She got both children to the stove first. She did not ask Silas whether he minded the order of things. He had already closed his eyes. She stripped Ruth's outer layers where the blanket had gone damp against the child's skin. She wrapped her in dry wool from her aunt's cedar chest, the heavy cream-colored blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar even after 3 years. She heated water on the stove and brought it to the temperature of a warm hand before she tried to give any to either child, because she knew what warming a hypothermic body too fast could do. She had read it in the medical pages of an almanac she had found in the outhouse of the second family she had lived with, and knowledge like that stays with a person. She got warm water into Nell first, then started rubbing Ruth's feet at the arches, careful and steady, watching the color in the child's face for any change. The change came in small increments. The wax went to gray. The gray went to a dull and tentative pink. She turned to Silas. She had known when she opened the door what she would find when she got back to him. She got him onto the bed and piled every blanket she had on top of him and held the cup of warm water to his mouth. He drank the smallest sip. His pale eye found her face and the sagging eyelid lifted part way, as though he had decided to give her the full attention of what he had remaining. "The system works," he said. His voice came from somewhere deeper than his chest, from the part of a person where the real accounting is done. "Now go teach it. Debt paid." He said one more thing. It was not to her. He said a woman's name quietly in the voice of a man who was 30 years younger, and then his eye moved past her to some part of the ceiling that was not the ceiling, and his chest did not rise again. She sat with him for the time it took the stove to work through one split of birch. She closed his eye with her thumb and said nothing over him because he had been a man who trusted results over ceremony. Then she crossed to the children because they were alive, and the alive required more of her than the dead. Nell was watching her with the still large eyes of a child who has understood more than the adults in the room intended. Ruth had begun to make small sounds, not words, not crying, the formless noises of a body coming back to itself from a cold place. She permitted herself one hard breath through her teeth. Then she looked at the door. If Silas had walked 11 miles in a storm at this temperature with 2 children on his back, the town he had come from was in worse trouble than one man could carry home. He would not have made that walk for any other reason, which meant there were people in Ash Fork Landing dying right now, in rooms that were failing, and she was the only person within 11 miles who knew what to do about it. Her eye moved to the brass key on the table. It had sat there for more than 2 years, turning in the firelight on the evenings she held it opening nothing. She thought about what Silas had told her. Not when they looked hard enough, when they were ready. She moved to Ingrid's wooden planer's chair, the one that stood against the west wall. Not the rocker, the other chair. The work chair, heavy and low back, the one her aunt had sat in for 19 winters, marking observations in the notebooks. She had moved it once to sweep behind it and found it heavier than she expected. Heavy in a particular way, settled rather than simply large. She had thought about that briefly, and then not again. She dragged it away from the wall. The plank beneath it had been laid with a care she recognized now that she was looking for it. The nails were countersunk. The joints were tight in a way the surrounding planks were not. She had walked over it every day for 2 years. The darning needle, the stove poker, her fingers. The plank came up in one clean piece as though it had been waiting for exactly this hand. In the shallow hollow beneath lay a small wooden box with blackened iron hinges and a brass lock recessed into a plate on the front face. The key fit the mechanism with no resistance at all, smooth and immediate. The lid rose. Inside, on a piece of folded oilcloth, lay a set of papers. She carried them to the table and spread them flat. The first sheet was a schematic rendered in her aunt's hand. A stove recognizable in its basic form, altered in a way she had never seen. A second chamber had been fitted above the primary firebox, sharing a sidewall through a plate of slotted iron. The flue pipe passed through this second chamber before leaving the building, which meant the hot gases were forced to surrender their heat a second time to the room before they rose to the sky. Below the drawing, in a hand that had grown thinner by the last winter of her aunt's life, were the words she had been waiting 2 years to find. For when the walls are not enough. Build this if the cold comes worse than 40 below, or if you must warm a house whose walls you cannot change. Needs a smith. 1/4-inch iron plate. Second chamber takes the flue heat before it leaves the pipe. Adds 20 degrees to the room. This is the piece I did not finish. Whoever finds this, finish it for me. Thora folded the papers, once folded them again, slid them inside her shirt against the skin of her ribs. She woke Nell. She stacked wood beside the stove until the pile reached the child's shoulder. She showed the older girl which pieces to add to the fire and which to leave. She left water and what bread she had on the table. She told Nell not to open the door for anyone but her, and she told her this in the direct, clear voice of one practical person to another without softening it. Nell nodded once. She did not cry. Something in her had already gotten older by the length of a whole season in the space of one night. Thora put on both coats. She wrapped her face in the wool scarf she kept by the door. She took the sharps because a wolf pushed this far down from the brakes by this storm would be beyond ordinary caution. She stepped over the place where Silas had been, which she was not ready to look at directly, and she went out into the dark. The wind hit her like a physical argument. She leaned into it and put one foot in front of the other, and she did not stop doing that for 7 hours. She did not remember most of those hours clearly afterward. She remembered a jackrabbit frozen on its side in a drift with its eyes still open and reflecting her lantern. She remembered a stretch where the track above the draw had drifted completely over, and she navigated by the angle of the wind on her left cheek and the sound the brakes made when the gusts funneled through the coulees. She remembered the moment she topped the last ridge and saw, far below in the flat where Ash Fork Landing crouched against the cold, the single orange window of a kerosene lamp that was still burning. She reached Prudence Ash Fork's boarding house as the sky went from black to deep gray. She pounded on the door with the flat of her mittened hand until the latch moved. Prudence stood in this doorway holding a lamp, 3 shawls over a wool dress, her hair undone and standing out at the temples. Behind her in the main room, 14 people pressed together under every blanket in the building. 2 of the children on the floor had the pale, waxy look on their cheeks that Thora had spent the last 6 hours trying not to think about. The thermometer above the sideboard read 22 degrees. The 2 women looked at each other across the threshold. There was an entire account book of grievance between them, and both of them understood this, and neither of them had the luxury of it right now. Wood, Thora said. Your back shed. How much? Half a cord, Prudence told her. Bring it inside. All of it. Right now. She set herself up in the center of the main room and directed everything. She used the charcoal from the hearth to mark the wall where the gap between the wood and the log had to land. She had the hired men tear up the pantry shelving for floor runners. She cracked a piece of kindling across her knee to show the split-face rule. She lashed the corners with baling twine because there was no willow and the twine was what the room contained. 6 hours. By the time the eastern sky went from iron to pale, the north wall of the boarding house was stacked floor to ceiling, and the west wall was halfway done, and the thermometer above the sideboard read 41 degrees. One of the wax-cheeked children on the floor began to cry, which was the finest sound Thora had heard in longer than she could account for, because a child dying of cold does not use the energy to cry. She did not stop. She went to the Reverend Kettleman's schoolhouse, where 9 families had gathered, and the west wall was losing the argument with the wind. She went to the Halstead place, 7 people and a failing stove. She went to the smithy of Ephraim Locke, a widower of 31 with a beard the color of new rope, who had on his own initiative already begun lining his forge shed with split cordwood because Dr. Doyle had mentioned something at a checkers game 8 months earlier, and it had stuck with him. He met her at the door with the look of a man who had been up all night being useful and was prepared to keep going. She pulled the folded papers from inside her shirt and spread them flat on the anvil in the warmth of the banked forge fire. "Can you build this?" she asked. "Tonight." He studied the schematic with the focused quiet of a man reading something in a language he knows well. He looked up. "Show me the piece that is not obvious," he said, and she put her finger on the slotted iron plate between the 2 chambers, and he nodded and turned to the forge and began building the fire back up without another word. On the 8th night of the storm in the back bedroom of the Halstead house, where the family had pressed together around a stove, working as hard as it could, the youngest child, a girl of 3 named Marion, went blue at the mouth and stopped answering when her name was called. The sound Thora heard from Marion's mother was not a scream. It was lower and steadier than that, and it was worse. She took Marion's pulse. It was there. She sent the oldest Halstead boy through the storm to the smithy with a note that said, "Only bring it now." And she pressed her coat around the child while she waited and counted the pulse at the thin wrist and kept counting. Ephraim arrived within the hour with the assembled stove on a hand sledge, the iron still ticking as it shed the heat of the forge. Together they hauled the failing stove out through the kitchen door and set the new one in its place. The pipe fit the existing flue with 2 inches of adjustment. She fed the fire herself small pieces first, building the combustion before she asked the wood for more. The second chamber glowed at the joint where it met the primary box. Then it dulled to flat black as the metal stopped expanding and began to do its work. She stood with her hand held 2 inches from the flue pipe above the second chamber and felt the difference in what the pipe gave off compared to what a single-chamber stove put out. The heat was staying in the room instead of going up the sky. Within the hour, the thermometer in the Halstead kitchen had climbed 21 degrees. Marion's lips went from blue to gray to an outraged and astonished pink. She opened her eyes and looked at her mother and began to cry with the full lung capacity of a healthy 3-year-old, which meant she was crying considerably. Ingrid Ashwell had been dead 6 years that January. She had died alone in a drawer with a sentence unfinished on the table in front of her, and the town she had lived 11 miles from had not sent anyone to the funeral because there had not been one. On the 8th night of the storm of 1888, in the back bedroom of a house she had never set foot in, a design she had drawn but never built with her own hands, warmed a child back to her mother. Thora stood with her back against the kitchen wall and let that fact settle through her, the way heat settles through a room slowly and from every direction at once, until it reached the places that had been cold for a long time. A person's work does not end when the breath does. It ends when the last useful thing they put into the world finally gives out. By that measure, Ingrid Ashwell had a long time left. The storm lasted 12 days. When it finally broke, Ashfork Landing counted its losses. 3 dead. Old Mrs. Barrow, whose heart stopped while she was shoveling a path to her coal shed on the 6th morning. 2 freight hands, both of them customers of Barclay Moss, who had purchased firewood from the Moss yard the week before the storm and had discovered on the 3rd night of the killing cold that the wood had been sold to them wet at the core, green under the bark where the axe had never split it, so that it hissed and steamed and gave off almost nothing against a wind that was giving them everything. The story traveled the way stories travel in a small place, where everyone knows whose cousin works at which yard and who sold what to whom before the storm. Nobody said anything to Barclay Moss directly. There was no meeting. There was no petition. What happened was quieter and more final. In the spring, when the yards opened for the season, nobody bought from him. The freighters bought elsewhere. The ranchers bought elsewhere. The boarding houses bought elsewhere. Within 8 months, the doors of the Moss yard were closed. Barclay took the eastbound train to Cheyenne and did not come back. His son, a young man of 19 who had kept his opinions about his father private for years because he was 19 and had to reopen the yard the following autumn, with fair prices and a printed handbill explaining the Ashwell method to any customer who wanted to use their wood more carefully. Prudence Ashfork came to the draw once on a morning near the end of March when the snow had gone off enough for a sleigh to manage the track. She wore the black bombazine again. She did not come inside the cabin. She stood at the door and held out a bound notebook that Thora had never seen. "Your aunt sent this to me in the winter of 1881, Prudence said. Her voice had lost some particular quality of assurance that had been in it every time Thora had heard her speak before. She asked me to have it printed and distributed at the store. She said the method would save lives if people knew it. I kept it. I did not print it. I return what I took. I do not ask forgiveness." Thora accepted the notebook with both hands. She looked at Prudence Ashfork for the length of one measured breath. "You did more harm with a closed drawer than most people do with a weapon," she said. "That is between you and whatever you answer to. Do not come here again." Prudence lowered her eyes. She turned and climbed back into the sleigh. The horse took the track at a walk, and the sleigh moved up out of the draw and over the ridge and was gone. Within the month, Prudence had sold the mercantile to a family from Laramie named Pratt and had taken the train east to Boston, where she had a widowed sister she had not spoken to in a decade. No one in Ashfork Landing spoke of her often after that, and when they did, it was in the careful past tense, a town reserved for people who have settled their accounts by leaving before the accounts could be settled for them. Thora buried Silas Trueblood on the rise above the draw in the ground beside the mound that was already there. She dug the grave herself in the last week of January when the storm had broken enough that the ground could be worked. She planted a ring of wild plum cuttings around both graves because she had heard Silas say once on an autumn afternoon, while he was watching her mark moisture lines on the outer courses of the east wall, that a hard country deserved one stubborn, pretty thing that came back every spring and bloomed without asking anyone's permission. Dr. Doyle sent his circular east with the supply riders when the roads opened in the spring. A territorial agricultural paper ran a piece on the Ashwell interior wood wall method for emergency wintering that summer, and Thora read it at Doyle's kitchen table and made him change the order of the names before she would let him send the correction in. Ingrid's name appeared above hers in every version that was printed after that. She opened a workshop in the small shed behind the old livery, which Silas had left her along with his carpenter's chest and a sound mule document in his careful hand, transferring ownership that she found in the saddlebag of the roan 2 days after she buried him. She built floor runners and wall braces and ceiling cleats for families who wanted to learn the method, and she charged what people could pay, which was sometimes money and sometimes meat and sometimes nothing, and that was the arrangement she had made with herself about how the work would go. She married Ephraim Locke on a September afternoon in 1894 in the schoolhouse with the Delaney girls in attendance. Nell was 16 by then, and Ruth was 14. Both of them grown into the particular self-possession of young women who have survived something and know they have, though they do not talk about it directly. She and Ephraim had 3 children. They grew up in a frame house in Ashfork Landing with a good stove and walls that their mother had helped to think through. And they grew up knowing without being told that wood was not simply fuel. It was insulation first, and then it was fuel. And the order of those two things was the whole difference between a family that made it through January and one that did not. She went back to the draw every week for 60 years. She swept the cabin floor. She opened the notebooks in the glass case she had built for them and checked that the pages had not dampened at the edges. She sat sometimes in her aunt's work chair and read the marginal notes in a Dead Man's Apprentice book that a woman had improved over 19 winters, and she thought about the nature of work that outlives the hands that did it. She died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1947 at 79 years old in Silas's old workshop behind the livery, sitting in a chair with a length of half-plane birch across her knees and a smoothing chisel still in her right hand. Her eldest daughter, coming in with coffee, said afterward that her mother had looked busy rather than gone, and that she had thought for a moment that she had simply dozed off over the work, and that it was only when she touched her hand that she understood the difference. The cabin stands in the draw above the little powder breaks. The birch grove has grown back thick enough in the 60 years since the great storm that a person walking the ridge above the seep can lose sight of the roof for whole minutes until the angle shifts and the tin chimney flashes in the low winter light. The notebooks lie in a glass case in the main room where anyone who comes to look can read the first line of the first one without breaking the seal. Beside the case hangs a cross-section of the interior wood wall as it stood in January of 1888, blackened along its innermost course, where a girl of 19 burned her fuel one careful stick at a time through 12 days of cold that killed cattle standing in the open field and could not touch her. The schoolhouse in Ashfork Landing teaches the physics of it every fall. Low thermal conductivity, trapped dead air. The principle that a piece of fuel can shelter a body before it burns, and that the order of those two acts in a hard country is the difference between the ones who come through and the ones who do not. The north wind still comes down from the Powder River breaks every January, the way it always has, and the way it will continue to do long after the last person who remembers any of this is gone. It comes with the same intention it has always had. It has to argue with the birch trees first, and then with the walls, and then with the memory of 2 women who built something that was meant to last and did. It has not won yet.